What's up, everybody? We're back. Really sorry for the delay in videos. Things have been really busy with opening up the new space and a lot of mix work recently, but we're back here and we're going to drop a new series. And dropping a new series, to me, kind of feels like a band dropping an album. Really hope you like it and enjoy it. And this series is going to tackle the question, how are you struggling to get your mixes to feel loud? Or if you are getting your mixes loud, do they actually feel small and squashed? Well, I'm going to discuss what I consider to be the 4 pillars of loudness, my 4 pillars of loudness. And the first one is understanding your transients. So today we're going to hop inside the DAW and we're going to look at how to uncover what our transient information is telling us and how to use that to our advantage in achieving a loud mix and the vibe that we want. So let's get started. Loud is a feeling, and transients are the feeling of being punched. They're fast and they're physical. A transient is a sudden short burst of energy at the beginning of a sound. It is a time-based event measured in milliseconds. It's not a certain frequency, a certain volume, or a click that can be boosted with EQ. It's characterized by a fast rise time and high amplitude, how quick the energy jumps then decays, not just where it lives on a frequency spectrum. So when we're thinking about loudness and creating a loud mix, loudness is perceived contrast, its harmonic content, and its transient behavior. If we want to start training our ears to recognize the various levels of transients in popular music and in mixed decisions, we can think of transients on a scale. So I've kind of put together a quick scale of songs, and we'll start with the songs with the least transient information and work our way up. And a song that I would put towards the bottom, or say at level 1, is Enya's Only Time. It's very pillowy and doesn't have a lot of punch. Above that, at the second level, would be the XX's Intro, and it's ambient and moody, and there's still not a lot of transient information. Above that, at the third level, I would put something like Lana Del Rey's Born to Die. It's warm and it's smooth, but we're not being hit over the head with transients. Above that, something like the Foo Fighters' Everlong. It's musical, it's full, it's powerful, it has strong transients, but it's not overly punchy. Above that, at our fifth level, would be Paramore's Misery Business. It's crisp, it's big, the transients are punchy but controlled. And I would put above that, at our top level, Green Day's Holiday. That is a showcase in transient punch. The mix is very loud and in your face. So when we think about these different levels, one of the most important points that we have to ask ourselves is, what kind of mix are we looking to craft? How loud is that mix supposed to be? And what are the role of the transients? What do I need from those transients? So whether you recorded yourself and are now getting ready to mix your work, or you were handed some source recordings and asked to be the mix engineer on the project, one of the first things we have to ask ourselves, especially if our goal is to build a loud mix, if that is the request of the artist or that is the goal you yourself have set for your project, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of transient information am I dealing with? And some of the easiest ways to start sorting that out are with just a few questions. And the first question you want to ask yourself is, do the transients have clear attack in solo? Yes, this is one instance when listening in solo is really important, because we're not really making mix decisions right now. We're essentially playing detective. We're going through, we are making notes as to the impact of our transients in the material that we were handed. So yes, you could probably guess it. We are going to use some drums here because they are rich in transient information, and we're going to listen to a drum set in solo, and we're going to evaluate the transients. I think we'd all agree that we're hearing the front end, the quick rise of the kick and the snare. I think of them as like a mountain peak, and then inside that, a level, like a meter kind of coming up. And how quick do we get to that peak? That's what I kind of hear in terms of a transient. Sometimes I don't want it to feel too thin or too clicky, like it's spiking immediately right up to that peak, but rather it feels like it's taking a moment, or that peak isn't as pointed top, but rather more of like a U shape, or sometimes even just kind of flat. That depends on the vibe we're going for. And loudness and transients, while there's information here, we also have to recognize that it can be a vibe as well. So right now, for what we're listening to, the kick and the snare feel like the transient information is proper for the track itself. Now let's listen to this with the rest of the mix. And when I say mix, I'm just referring to raw session files. Nothing's actually mixed. And we're going to pay attention to, are the kick and snare still cutting through? through. If they're not cutting through, what we want to ask ourselves is it because something feels like it's overlapping? It's now blocking that transient from getting through, like maybe a guitar or a vocal that could be in the exact same frequency range as where that transient is speaking to us, or if the transients just aren't really that punchy enough to come through, because that's going to help us inform the next, decisions downstream. Are we trying to resolve this with some EQ on some other instruments and some spatial decisions, or do we need to start looking at ways to enhance the physical transient of the drum? So here we go now, the whole mix we're going to evaluate again. We're listening to hear if we can hear that mountaintop aspect of the kick and snare poking through. That's what I want you to fix your ear on.
I've been telling myself this for days. I don't ever wanna go down and burn in fire nuclear rays.
Okay, so the vocal's really loud, the guitars are there and have all their presence, and I'm still getting the kick and snare cutting through. So as we build this mix, if I feel I need a little bit more, I can go and use tools like a transient shaper to help maybe add a little bit more snap, or some compression techniques. But right now I know that as I'm evaluating the transients in my drums, that I have solid transient information. So the third thing to do, that if you're really trying to put your transients under the trial by fire, would be to listen at a very low volume. And I'm going to try to execute this together by just pulling down the volume of your feed. And this is something I do quite often. I try to get even below like whispering volume. Like I could essentially have a conversation in the room, a couple inches from the speaker, and the volume coming out wouldn't impact that conversation at all. Because what that's telling us when we really bring the volume low is what's poking through. And we want that to be the transient information. So we'll pull this down, and in theory, without doing it yet, we should be left with essentially some of the top of the vocal, or being able to hear some of the intelligibility of the vocal still, snare and kick, and perhaps maybe a little bit of the top of the guitar or the bite of the guitar, but we might lose that. But we'll lose our rounded stuff first, like a bass in this thing. If we had like synths or pads, they would drop off pretty quick too, but this doesn't have it. So let's give it a shot, see what happens.
I've been telling myself this for days. I don't ever wanna go down and burn in fire nuclear rays. Now I'm cool and it feels like I'm living my youth.
So it's hard for me right now to tell what you're hearing, because this is just going right to the feed. But based off the volume that I brought myself down to, what I was left with was, again, the vocal and essentially kick and snare. So it sounded like vocals and drums. So I know that right now, if I was getting ready to mix and I'm doing my detective work on my transients, I know I'm in good shape. But what you want to know is, well, how do I know if I'm not in good shape? Like what would be an example of that? And I got you. What I have here is I have a snare drum, and then I duplicated the snare and essentially removed the transient from it. Now, the first thing I want you to do, we're going to listen to the mix with the regular snare in, and then I'm going to flick to the snare without a transient. The volume of the snares are level matched. So we're still going to hear the snare, but I want you to notice what happens when we remove that transient from the drum, how it impacts the feeling of what you're hearing. Okay, so let's listen first with the transient. That's this, and then when I switch to here, we're going to hear it without the transient.
I've been telling myself this for days. I don't ever wanna go down and burn in fire nuclear rays. Now I'm cool and it feels like I'm living my youth. I don't wanna turn you around.
That's a pretty stark contrast. You could hear the snare, but what you immediately lose is the feeling of a human being sitting behind that drum set and laying into the snare drum, and kind of the weight of the bottom of the drum. Like, we're thinking about that snare drum and the stick coming here. To me, that transient is at the bottom. It's that thunk, like you're hearing the sound kind of punch down. And when we don't have the transient in there, we immediately, like, you hear the snare, but you stop feeling the snare, you stop feeling the drums, you lose a little bit of that emotion. And that to me is so critical, because initially we don't necessarily separate listening with feeling and listening with transient and just hearing things in a mix. I know that I was guilty of it when I first started. I would just be like, oh, I can hear the snare drum. Snare drum's clear. Snare drum's loud. But there's no transient information. So the snare drum also sounds like I'm slapping a fish with a wet newspaper.
What the hell was that?
Well, you know what? I don't want to be mean the fish. So not slapping a fish with a wet newspaper, slapping a pillow with a wet newspaper. So the last thing we'll discuss is if we are faced with a decision like this, what do we do? And mixing is about three things. It's about fixing, fitting, and featuring. So we have to, along the way, collect lots of information and lots of tools that help us move quickly when we're trying to solve a problem, right? Because you can imagine the time it's going to take you to mix a song is going to quadruple if you have nothing in your tank in regards to trying to solve problems that you're hearing. So this is one that I hope you'll hold on to and feel free to pull out. We're going to put transient designers and things like that aside for a second, and we're going to look at essentially what happens if we try to apply an EQ or some harmonic saturation. So with EQ, remember, you can't EQ what's not there, but we can enhance what is there with EQ. And that's going to play a major role here. Going back to that analogy of the table, when my hand hits that table, I can't EQ that initial spike. What I can EQ essentially is the resonance of the table, the sound of that slap a little bit when it hits, but not how crisp, how sharp, and how punchy that is. EQ can't fix that. If I bring the pillow down and hit the table, same thing. Like we could EQ the thud of the pillow hitting the table, but all we can EQ is what's there and what's captured. I can't make the pillow slap sound like a hand slap. That's something that, EQ is not going to be able to help with. So when I pull up the regular snare drum, I have an EQ set up right here that would be, symbolic of maybe somebody coming back and saying, hey, can you put a little bit more weight in the drum or a little bit more body? I just want to feel a little bit more, low punch in the drum. And then we also set up, this is Waves Factory's Spectre. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly because I'm going to say it a bunch. And if I am mispronouncing it, I'm sure whoever knows the proper pronunciation will drive you crazy. So I apologize in advance. So first thing I'm going to do is we're going to play it in solo, the snare drum, and I want you to listen to what happens between these two. It was bringing up essentially the resonance in that area. So it was adding more weight. And if the snare drum felt light in the mix, doing this would be essentially like a crude way, but an effective way of doing it because we're bringing up some other things as well. You could hear that we were getting a little bit more kind of pong around the initial hit where it was a little cleaner without the EQ applied. We applied the EQ, we were getting a little bit more fuzziness, a little bit more resonance around it, but we were also getting some weight. So there's a trade-off there. We're getting the weight, but we're also kind of, smearing a little bit the bottom of the drum. Now let's listen to the Spectre. Really close to the EQ, maybe like percentage points cleaner, but again, it's adding some hair around that kind of punch spot of the drums and, some good fuzz to it, some weight, and you're definitely hearing more impact of what I would consider to be like the shell of the drum. So both of these were effective for, enhancing that information right there. Now let's go to the drum that has the transient scooped out of it. We're gonna pull up again the EQ and the saturation. Now this one's really fun. So I'm not going to set you up, no leading statements, just use your ear to where I guided to that kind of shell part of the snare drum. You tell me what you're hearing. Did you hear it? No, right? The EQ did nothing, like nothing. It added a little bit up here. We were getting a little bit of that top back, but it added zero weight, nothing. And that's because there's nothing there for it to grab onto. It just added a little bit of cloudiness down there. So it kind of, in my opinion, almost made the snare a little worse or a little confused in a sense in the bottom end. You can't boost what's not there. So in this situation with no transient, we were not able to manufacture a transient. Now let's listen to the harmonic saturation, the Spectre, and let's see if that does the same exact thing. So here we go. We we noticed that we actually were able to kind of manufacture some punch. Now, did we get this snare drum to be cracking like the drum, that has the transient? No, but it actually did give us the appearance of more weight there. And in the situation that we are in, where if we're not using, sample replacement, we're going to treat this like we have to solve this problem using tools we have. We were actually able to add some punch back in. So let's listen to the mix again with the dead snare, and then we're going to pop the Spectre on, and let's see if it actually helps to kind of put a little bit of emotion back into that snare drum.
I've been telling myself this for days. I don't ever wanna go down and burn in fire nuclear rays. Now I'm cool and it feels like I'm living my youth. I don't wanna turn you around, although I'm.
So we get some back. Again, it's not the snare drum on Teen Spirit by any stretch, but we are able to kind of put that back, and we could continue to kind of push that harder. Okay, so now let's quickly look at what happens if we try to put a transient designer. So what we did here, and I wasn't really getting too scientific, I was kind of cranking some attack because I know we needed attack. Pushing attack, pulling down the volume so that I'm not just getting fooled by level, and then I actually put that before the Spectre. So I'm kind of putting some transient in, then driving that into this in an attempt to manufacture a transient. So let's kind of compare that in the mix to the snare drum with the transient. So we'll take this off. We'll start with the snare drum with the transient.
I've been telling myself this for days. I don't ever wanna go down and burn in fire nuclear rays. Now I'm cool.
Okay, so with the transient shaper at the front, trying to put some attack back in, and then pushing that into a little bit of saturation, that actually got us back in the game. Are we all the way there? We're not. But when we're looking at trying to fix a problem, we were able to find a way to evaluate that the snare drum was lacking transient, that lack of transient was hurting the groove of the song, and to be able to put some transient back in that moves the groove forward, that helps to kind of really put some emotion back in the drum playing. So let's check out the reason why this works, especially the saturation aspect. So right here, I have a 200 hertz test tone set up, and I'm sending it into our evaluation. This is our evaluation right here, so we can see it coming through. I have the first queued up as if we were just trying to boost the fundamental. So again, like, oh, I got a snare drum, and that's what the transient is supposed to be, so let me boost this up, and let's see what happens. And then we're doing the same exact thing with the saturation tool, Spectre. Let's see what we notice. So when I first engage the EQ, what do we get? We just get more level, which kind of enforces what we were talking about. You can't boost what's not there. Really what EQ is doing is simply just taking the frequencies that you're deciding to boost and just adding more amplitude, more volume to them. So if there's not much information there, you're just adding more volume to junk in a way. And that can obviously be really destructive in your mix. But if you do have solid information there, it's going to help add a little bit more amplitude to that, as we saw when we did try to EQ the snare drum with transients. Because again, you might have been asking yourself when we were doing that, wait, EJ, didn't you once put out a video saying, are you EQing for transients or tonality? And while this channel, what we're doing is we keep kind of building on our concepts and helping to create an understanding of how this knowledge helps you get to more informed decisions and be able to craft the mix that lives inside your head. This is something now that we have to understand is, do we have transient information? So the assumption that the other video made was you have transients in your music, and now are you trying to EQ to enhance those transients, make them more present, or are you trying to increase or use your EQ to improve the tone of something, like we were talking about before with table, right? Like EQing it to change essentially the resonance of the table, or are you trying to EQ to impact the thud of the pillow and change that's tone or that's impact. Okay, so enough about that. I just went on way too long about that. Now watch what happens when we click on this, and I bet if you've seen any of our videos, especially the ones on tape and everything else, you're going to know exactly what's going to happen. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Oh man, there it is. All that harmonic content, right? What is that? That's harmonic density right there. So you can use a tape machine, you can use black box, you can use a decapitator, you can use Saturn, anything that essentially is going to take your fundamental and then in a nonlinear way is going to start kind of pushing out harmonics. That gives us that psychoacoustic sense of hearing something feeling fuller because we're getting more overtones in a tightly compact area that's helping to improve the perceived density of that. And when our snare drum was stripped of its punch in the body, this is how we kind of artificially manufactured that punch. So I hope you find that really interesting. I hope you find the first pillar of crafting a loud mix, which is your transient management, interesting. And I really hope that you experiment with these on your own. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to drop me any sort of comment below. I will be happy to get back to you. And I hope you stay tuned when we move on to discussing the next pillar, which is EQ, then compression after that, then clipping versus, limiting, and get a sense of how all these things impact what we hear as a loud mix. All right, my friends, have a great day.